top pot donut? We don't have that in Australia.
Mate. Okay, so when I got to the US, 2008, I'd like to think that the years leading up to that in Australia was pretty healthy, right? Like, you know, I lived opposite a Woolies and I'd cook most of my meals and like, you know, maybe have pizza on a Friday. And I get to the US and the first thing I discovered was they make the best hamburgers in the world. Like they're greasy.
Amongst other things.
I mean, yes, like you name it, but that's like at the top of the list. And so there was a particular place, Burgermaster, which I would go to a lot, which I really love. One day I'm driving down the street and I see this place called Top Pot Donuts. And I go, shit, that's pretty cool, I'll go in and try one. And I ordered a original glaze donut.
Sounds like a Krispy Kreme.
It is, but like the donuts are actually big and fluffy. Is there yeast ones, and then they've got cake ones which are small and like solid. So I go the yeast ones. I eat one and I'm like, this is the best fucking thing I've ever eaten in my life. So, and at that stage, my little one was fairly young. I'd take her with me, and then she became my little sidekick. And then the second one came, and all three of us would roll in deep and just eat donuts every single time. But the thing was so I was at Microsoft at that time, I was based on what they call main campus. But then I moved to a team called Live Labs, which was based in Bellevue, which is like, 5-10 minutes away from main campus.
Is this in Seattle?
This is all Seattle. This is not Seattle, it's like 30 minutes from Seattle, on what they call the east side. And so there was a Top Pot donut at the base, practically the base of my building. I could look from my office onto it with great desire. And so I would just go down there, order my coffee. They make great coffee. I'd get coffee, a donut, and then I would just work from there. And
it's a lot of posts, yeah. It's like,
yes, yeah,
I'm here,
yeah. And that was just when I was posting. There's at least 30 to 40% more time there where I was at. Yeah, epic donut. By the way, here's the story. It was actually called Top Spot. But when they were bringing the sign back from Oregon or wherever the fuck they bought it, the S fell off and they were just like, fuck it. And they just hung it up. It was called Top Pot. So there you go, right?
Oh, I love that. Now, you were talking to me off camera about you had a company you built and grew here and exited.
Yeah.
You've done 3 more in America.
Yeah.
So for an Aussie watching this, that's a lot of exits in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So honestly, tell me, what is your little secret thing that allows you to facilitate or make an exit happen quick?
So I think if you're an entrepreneur, you either subscribe to like 1 or 2 schools. There might be more, but I think of it this way. You can either follow a very traditional purist view of building a product. You go speak to customers, you find out their needs, you make sure there's enough of them to make a business, you innovatively think about the design of how to build a solution for them, and then you make sure that they like that, and then you go and sell that, right? And I would call that like a very purist way of building a product. And those tend to scale to like public companies, multi-million dollar exits. Mm-hmm. If you are really good at engineering and building tough things, but you're not necessarily good at the product side, and that's very much me, right? So I feel like I could build anything, but I'm not really good at like the business and customer piece as well as others are. So my first startup was really looking at businesses that were already operating, and the one thing they just didn't do well. Mm-hmm. And the thing that they didn't do well was because they just couldn't do the engineering as well, because there's only a few people they could hire to do that. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I'll just build that. I'll go and sell that to their customers, get on their radar, become enough of an irritation to them, and they'll acquire me, right? And mm-hmm. I'll essentially do what they can't do. I'll do it in a very short period of time, and then I'll maximize my exit. And I think what I liked about that is you don't have to raise a lot of money. And even though you might exit at the $10, $20 million mark, you own 30-40% of the company. So, right? But the thing is, as you take more and more investment and dilute your ownership of the company, you might have a $100 million company, but if you own 3%, who cares, right?
Yep.
And the other thing is those tend to take 10 years, 15 years to build those companies, whereas I can build something pretty well in 18 months, mm-hmm. enough to get the attention of a bigger fish.
So with the end in mind, you're kind of almost engineering it around knowing that it's going to be bought because it'll be annoying and it'll be competing better than...
I mean, I'm a big believer in play to your strengths, right? Like, I think for example, if you're good at hiring really great people, mm-hmm. solving really hard technical problems, just do that and find a buyer for that. So I turned my startups into products. and my customers were buyers, the big companies, right? So
they're buying the talent you develop
they're
just
buying
as
the
much
team
as
and the tech, right? Because they can't do it internally, and so when they absorb it, they just get a boost of that DNA, right, and that product. So I realized I was good at that. Went to the US, worked for 2 years with the Windows Azure team, and then a really good mate of mine, pinged me and it was like, hey, I've got this idea, and to use a crude term, it's like a flipper. Right, you're building a flipper, right? Because you are actually going out to the investors saying, my strategy is to build this component, this widget, make sure that we validate it with this big buyer's customers, and then we just go to them and say, hey, we're either a threat or an asset to you, decide which one. So that was Retail Me Not. We were Zen Deals, we were enough of a irritation for Retail Me Not, and they bought us. Then we did Super, same thing again with Broomley. And then the last one was CodePilot, and that was AngelList. And so I think for me, I like it. Now, a lot of purists would look down at their nose and go, ugh, why would you ever build a company purely to sell it, right? Like, I think it's just a model, right? And my model is, I think it's fast. If you're good at what you do, it's low risk. And it's fun because you get to do 4 startups, in the matter of 12 years. And
so AngelList bought CodePilot, because when a lot of people look at AngelList, they just feel, it's just a platform where you go to jump in someone's syndicate. But is there a whole other side to AngelList?
So what happened with AngelList is exactly right. Startups go on there and then they take partial investment from syndicates.
Yep.
And then what happened was those startups were like, you must know a lot of people, right? Like, we're trying to build teams, and the number one problem for every startup is talent. So they started a talent business, and then that talent business initially was just like, hey, put your details on AngelList. Startups who are coming to get funding will also potentially hire you. And then that turned into A-List, which is more of a white glove service. And then that's where they needed that technology to help the matching and work out which candidates were high value. And that's what CodePilot did. So again, you're looking for that gap in their roadmap, knowing it's difficult enough that they won't do it for the next 2 years, and you get in and do that, they're going to acquire you, right? Like, it's in their interest to not, because you also want to pick something that when they come down to the build or buy conversation, they've already thought about the build long enough to go, we've tried it, guys. And that was the internal conversations at Retail Me Not. They were like, we've been trying this for 2 years, we can't crack it. They've cracked it, let's just buy them. So you kind of simplify that.
How did you convince Jeff Bezos to employ you when Bill Gates was your former employer?
So the AWS experience was really fun because I arrived back in 2019 and was still working and helping AngelList for a little while into 2020. And then a really good mate of mine, Frank Arrigo, and I were chatting, and he's like, hey, there's this role in the startup team for a CTO. That sounds like perfect for you. So I went and met with Rachel Newman, who was running the team at the time. Super awesome operator, VC. She's amazing. And I was like, if I get the chance to work with you, absolutely. I didn't really care it was AWS, right? I was just like, you seem amazing. Your team seems amazing. So Rohit, for example, who does Startup Playbook, is on that team as well. And so I was like, this is a great team. I want to go work with them. And I tell you what, it was the best experience. Amazon is the creme de la creme of what it takes to be customer obsessed and build epic product. And if you want to learn how to do it that well, don't bother going to uni and learn it. Go get a job at Amazon and just sit there for 2 years, and it'll just kind of seep into you. So
that's big.
Massive props to them. They're epic. Like, I'll say, Microsoft knows how to do multiple things well and do it over and over again. Like, they take big bets. They're not always the first there, but they get there and they do well.
Like, it feels like an older company, but then Spotify is pretty cool.
I mean,
LinkedIn's pretty cool.
Right, yeah.
It's come good too.
Yeah. I think, again, I love Microsoft, I love Amazon. I think they're amazing for different reasons. I am so grateful for the chance I got to work at both of those companies. And they absolutely define me as a professional, either as an engineer or a product leader. So, yeah, I love
Can I ask, when you see Joe Rogan get courted by Microsoft and Spotify on like $100 million deal, and it seems like the only clause really is that he can't have his show on Apple. What does it make you think when you see a deal of that nature take place, and what are they actually doing there?
I mean, look, I think all of the tech companies are fighting for mindshare with the consumer, right? And if you take Microsoft and Amazon and Spotify and think about them as consumer business or their customers being consumer. In today, if you to cut through the noise and get to the consumer and win their heart and mind, you need to find the people that have already done that. And so I can totally understand that what you will start to see as they become more and more closer to the customer is that they start to resemble media organizations, right? And people always look at Amazon and go, "Oh, Amazon's such a big tech company." No, they're not. They're an online bookstore that had to build amazing technology to be a better online bookstore. At the heart of Amazon is a bookstore. Mm-hmm. They don't think of themselves as technology first. Microsoft was a technology company. They built drivers for printers back in the day and an operating system. So they have a long way to go in understanding what it means like to be really close to the customer. Mm-hmm. So I think what you'll start to see with those real high-tech companies is they're going to become more like consumer retail companies who are just really good at tech. But what they're really selling, right, is consumer retail experiences, so far abstracted away from where they started. Apple's the same.
Tell me, did you ever get the opportunity to go to a Microsoft conference with Steve Balmer where he comes out and he goes, developers.
I have the best Steve Balmer story for you.
Oh, give it to me.
Yeah. So when I joined Microsoft, I joined this team, Red Dog, and Red Dog was what became Windows Azure. At the time, it reported into what was called Corp R&D, which was run by Ray Aussie. So Ray Aussie was handpicked by Bill Gates to take over as the chief software architect at Microsoft. So, and Ray Aussie is a big deal. Like, he invented Lotus Notes, and like he's a massive deal, right? So that whole team reported up to Steve Balmer, who's the CEO at the time. So because we were kind of like a special little snowflake in that group, we got a lot of FaceTime, and Steve would come and like walk around the building. And when Steve Balmer comes to visit you in your building, his private security come with you. And what they do is they stand at the corners of the hallways with these briefcases between their legs. And everyone supposes that there's guns and whatnot in there, right? There's a bug out bag inside, but who knows? It could just be pictures.
Are they just release forms or something?
Who knows what it is, right? Yeah, exactly. It's his like lunch list or whatever. But it was always a big deal. So one day I was in a meeting. When I say I was in a meeting with Steve Balmer, I'm in a meeting with 200 other people in the biggest conference room we've ever seen. And he's there like the emperor talking to the great unwashed. And so rewind the story a little bit. I had a photo of my oldest daughter when she was about 8 months old. And I had it on the coffee table at home. And then Microsoft would send employees this magazine every quarter, right, of like what's happening at Microsoft, and on it was Steve Balmer. And I just happened to put it on the coffee table, and looking at both of them, she looked just like Steve Balmer.
Really?
And so I nicknamed that photo the baby Balmer, because she's sitting on my lap and she's got this kind of like look, she's looking at the camera, and he's the same thing, he's at some like forum someplace and he's looking at the camera. It's like, oh my God, right? So I get to Redmond, I'm in a meeting, and I get to know Steve Balmer and Ray Aussie's EAs, their executive assistants. So I email one of the EAs and I'm like, I have this photo. Is there any way Steve could sign it? And she goes, no, we don't do signatures anymore. There was a time when the executives would sign shit, but then they were like, we're not signing him anymore. So I was like, oh, that's kind of a bummer. So anyway, a couple of days later, she emails me back and she goes, hey, come drop this picture off, because you've got me intrigued, right? So I go and drop this photo off. She puts it amongst a bunch of documents that he has to sign every day. He's like the president, right? So signs all these documents and contracts or whatever. So the story goes that she tells me after she gives it back to me is that this photo is inside this stack of papers. He's there signing, not with like a signature pen, a blue biro, right? Gets to this photo, goes, what is this? She tells him the story. He goes, ha, and he signs. But the thing is, he signs his legal signature. So when he signs things like, no, it's just Steve Balmer. When he signs his legal, it's Stephen G. Balmer. And that's what's signed in blue biro on this photo that's framed in my bedroom. And
baby Balmer.
The baby Balmer, right? And it's my favorite story from being there. When it arrived in the internal yellow envelope and I opened it up, and I rang her and she told me the story, I was like, that's priceless.
So if you had to rate him, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, probably Elon now in the same conversation, like who to you has made the biggest impression, or do you find is the most dynamic or doing the greatest things, or the most just amazing to witness?
So out of those, I never got to see Bill Gates, right? Like I only got to ever have very cursory observational experiences with Steve Balmer, and had some really close opportunities with Ray Aussie, which was great. I have to say though, out of them all, the one I probably align with most is Bezos. And the reason is that I think that if you try to do anything without thinking about your customer, you're either going to introduce your own assumptions, right, which are probably going to be wrong, or you're going to act with proxies and stories and biases around what you're going to do. What I love, but here's the thing, going and talking to customers is really hard. I think what he did was he embodied a spirit and a culture which is all about doing that hard thing and then working backwards from it. And I think the discipline required to do that is really high. And those that do it reach these incredible, levels, right? So it's not hard to understand why Amazon is so amazing and so successful and loved by a lot of its customers, because they put the customer front and center, and they do not accept anything less than that. So I look at him and I look at what he did in the early days and the culture he built, and I'm like, that's what you have to aspire to, right? Because it's also highly credible. It's very hard to dispute that, right? Like the proof is there. So
is it true that he was caught eating an iguana at one point in time?
Was he?
Yeah, I found that online. There
really?
Was one, yeah,
he
when
was
he was
eating
younger.
an iguana.
And also here, I want to ask you, true or false, Amazon, was it once named Abracadabra?
That sounds familiar, actually.
Yeah?
That does sound familiar.
True or false, do you reckon?
I say true.
Actually, it's false. It was Cadabra.
Oh, Cadabra. I know it was something before it was that. I know that the little guy at the bottom, the little arrow, points from A to Z.
Yep.
So I know that at least.
Now, did you know that the name Lemphers, your last name, means caring, master of their own destiny, charisma, and true?
Really?
There you go, mate.
Is it Dutch? I thought I heard it was from a Dutch origin, right?
Well, what's your background? Sri Lankan, did you mention?
Yeah, so like parents are Sri Lankan, born in
Yeah.
Sri Lanka, immigrated in the 70s to Australia.
Yeah.
And then on my mum's side, I think it traces up to France, and then on my
Yes.
dad's side to Holland. So the name's my dad's side, so I'm guessing it's somewhere in that Dutch kind of.
Now tell me about your experience and time at Techstars, and then also Austin. What the experience is like.
Yeah,
because right now you probably experienced what Austin was 10 years ago, but we're all talking about it just now.
Yeah. And it's funny, right? So I like to think that if I was to pick a location on the map, I would never have picked Seattle. Right, I went there because that's where Microsoft was, and then Austin was the same. I would never have thought to live in Austin, other than we got acquired and we all moved out there. When I moved out there, what I loved about Texans is they're so much like Australians. Like,
really,
you never have to worry where you stand with a Texan. Like, they'll tell you straight up, and they're not afraid to tell you either, right? Like, whereas in Seattle it was a little bit tougher because they're not going to tell you necessarily what they feel. Through their actions, and even then, not always, right? Like, they'll endure a lot of personal discomfort to not be impolite to you, right? Which is so odd to me. And so when I got to Austin, it was really refreshing to be around people who are much like what I grew up in Australia. But what I also loved about Austin is they're not afraid to really try anything. So if America's spirit is defined by a real appetite for risk, Austin really embodies that, right? Like,
really?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, why not? You could try anything in Austin, and there's stories of people who've made, look at Epic Jerky, the company, right? Sold from billions of dollars to General Mills.
Really?
Likewise, HomeAway sold for billions to Expedia, right?
Yeah.
Like, you've got tech, you've got food, you've got music.
Is the line "Keep Austin Weird"? Is that
Keep Austin weird?
Yeah. There's a marathon, isn't there? Where
keep San Antonio lame.
San Antonio lame.
But it's Keep Austin Weird, or Don't Dallas My Austin is another one.
Don't Dallas my
Yeah,
Austin.
don't bring the Dallas.
Because Debbie's currently doing it.
Well, then no one wants Dallas, no one wants Houston. Leave that where it is, and yeah.
So is Austin a big Christian city?
Not really, actually. It's a pretty chill city. I think again, the thing is that Austinites say Austin is surrounded by Texas. It's not in Texas.
Okay.
And they don't believe themselves to be Texan.
Did you get a chance to go to Joel Osteen's mega church in Houston? Why not? Kanye just spoke. It was amazing.
I like to stay far away from Like if I'm indulging in fantasy, I kind of want it to be something that I'm helping create. Like,
what's the biggest difference between raising children in the States to here?
Far out.
And how did that impact your decision to come back?
Look, I think you have to be, in the US, it's look, there's not a lot of resource in the US, right? So it's an absolute knife fight to get to the top. And if you don't, you're gonna stay at the bottom and it's gonna be really hard for you. So when you're raising kids in the US, you have to be really aware of like what kind of launch pad you're creating for them. And you have to really think 3-4 steps ahead, you know, because there's no story where they just kind of, you know, incidentally or coincidentally just meander along and are okay, right? So you have to be very, very thoughtful.
So it's either polar opposite.
Yeah, so that cognitive load as a parent is super high. Like you have to make very good decisions constantly to make sure that your kids are okay in the future. But at the same time, growing up in Australia, it's very different, right? Like Australia, you can go surf at the beach, you can be a bit more larrikin and relaxed, be a bit more loose, and still take care of business and do well and be comfortable. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, what I realized was, and you know, this took a while to understand, but I think what happened was I replaced the idea of status and what it meant to work at these big companies and make lots of money and be successful with what it means to be happy, right? And the problem is when you set your value and your self-worth as being these outputs, when you get there, they never add up, right? And so there was a moment absolutely where after, you know, would have been after we exited Super, where you're sitting at my pool and just thinking to myself, none of this really makes me happy. You know, what I really want to be doing is out there surfing and riding bikes and having quality time with my girls. And, you know, I want to be living my life. I don't want to be working for my investors or working for, you know, this idea that we have to make an exit or like do really well or appear in whatever paper that was happening at the time.
So when Michael Jordan wins an NBA championship, he smokes a cigar, you know, and he really makes a point of absorbing and taking in the moment and celebrating as a necessary measure for marking that moment in time. You've had these 4 exits. Has what you've done to mark the milestone and celebrate each time been different? And can you give us some examples of how you treated yourself?
Mate, what a great question. So I remember when I was 24, right, and sold my first startup, I took 6 months off and played video games nonstop. It was like I'm treating myself.
Did you get really good?
I mean, I played Mafia, and yeah, I got really good at it. And my brother I was living with my brother at the time. We shared a place in South Bank. He would come home and tell me about his day, and I'd tell him my day. Like, oh, I took out Don Vito, and he's just like, you've got to go get a job, dude. Like, this is ridiculous. But I felt like indulging myself, right? And I could. And then when we sold Zen Deals, I bought a bottle of this really expensive scotch, which was, what's the Bruichladdich is the brand, and so I bought a bottle of that because I was like, I want something really special. And the story of the
how much would that cost?
It was about $300. And the Bruichladdich story was that these guys had opened up a brewery, like opened up a distillery that had been shut down for 100 years and took the barrels that had been left there, restored them, and then brewed. This guy called the Lad was the one from Bruichladdich. Wow. And I thought, what a story. I want that. But here's what's really sad. By startup number 3, you literally just go get lunch together and you just move on. Like it stops being special. And then with Code Pilot to AngelList, I don't think I celebrated crap. I grabbed a coffee like every other day and just, so it's interesting that like when I look at my very first exit, it was incredibly special and I took 6 months off and played video games, right? And then the next one I bought a bottle of scotch, and by the 3rd and 4th, I was just like, who gives a shit, right? And so I think that tells a story as well of why it was time to like take a break from doing that.
So how has creating those exits changed your life? Because obviously now you've been able to unlock financial freedom. You can choose what you wish to do. Yeah. Which for a lot of people would be something they'd aspire to, but also there'd be something quite daunting to then working out, well, I've got so many choices, what do I actually do now? Like I can see how that would make a person anxious.
Yeah, I think it does 2 things, right? you have now created a legacy or a story that you feel obliged to keep up, right? And so every time you speak with someone, like especially old investors and folks, the question is like, oh, how are you doing? How's the family doing? So what are you doing next, right? And you know what their vector in is, right? Like they're just like, what are you going to do next to help me like make more money?
Can I give you some money?
Right.
Can you go and do it?
Right. And so there's that. You end up realizing that when you started and no one cared about you and yet you were doing it all by yourself, it's kind of like, if you fail, who cares? No one knows. And then if you fail, the anxiety gets far bigger as you get more and more. The other thing though is that it makes you really question why you do any of these things, right? And I think the first time I did it, I had no idea. I was just young and dumb and just went, oh, I'll do a startup, who cares? And then the next time around, it was far more methodical and we wanted to make money from it. And then I think the next two is just like, that's what you do. You just do it and you don't think about it. And I think now, for me, if I was to do another startup, it would take a lot of consideration and thought. You're right though as well, right? Like you get to a certain level of success and you start, like, I think there was a time, especially in my second startup, where I was looking in the mirror going like, do you think you're good enough to do this? Like, and how willing are you to actually go and see? Because it's one thing to go like, I think I'm a good entrepreneur. I think I could make a couple of startups, and you never do it. You don't have to answer that question, right? It's always a what if. Yep. You go and do that and you fail and you're a failed entrepreneur. You do it well 4 times, you're like, now you're a successful entrepreneur. You can tell yourself a story about what that means, but it does unlock a level of comfort because you are less susceptible to the things that most people are. For example, you can get a job and you don't need it. So I could spend 1.5 years at Amazon and not care about what my review looked like, what my boss thought, just do what I wanted to do, what I thought was the right thing to do. So you're suddenly relieved of the need to worry about what other people think, and you can really just cut your own path. So I don't think about the financial freedom as much as I think about the personal freedom of being able to go, you don't have to second guess yourself anymore, right? Like if you think that's the path to take it. And if someone says, I don't agree, or I don't know, that's fine, you do your thing and I'll do mine. Whereas there was a time in my life where I was like, I kind of do need to think about what people think, and you know, if they think it's a bad idea, maybe I should consider that. So
we all good? Yep. So I want to ask you, you've come back to little old Australia where property prices are through the roof.
Yep.
And everyone wants to own a property.
Yeah.
And shares are still a very kind of, particular thing for a certain amount of people. But there's this growing class of people who are getting into things like Raise and eToro and having a little try, and they're rounding up using apps and they're sort of getting familiar with diversifying. And then along comes this crypto thing and Bitcoin and everything. I mean, where's it going next? Where are you predicting? Where would you say? I mean, I think you're involved with a couple of things in the green energy space and everything, but like, where's going to blow up? Especially for an Australian business or from an Australian perspective, because we know in Australia we can't win at every vertical and every industry.
I think, first of all, I think Australia has so far to go in building domestic consumer experiences. And, because of our heritage, right? Like it started with like, if you can't shave it off a sheep's back or pull it out of the soil, then it's not worth getting into, right? That changed. And now you look at some of these businesses, Canva's a great one, right? Like, or Airwallex, right? Like purely digital businesses who are crushing it, but still to a large degree, business to business. And I think that what's going to happen is we are slowly going to get past that era or kind of journey in B2B, entrepreneurship, right? Because selling the business is fairly easy and low risk, right? And I think what we're going to see the next big push is those entrepreneurs are going to go like, I don't want to, because that's what entrepreneurs do. They go, I did that. I want to do the next big thing. I don't want to do the thing I did before. So they're going to say, well, what does it look like to build a highly successful domestic but exportable consumer technology offering? So where does the Snapchat or the WhatsApp or Spotify get built in Australia, such like Atlassian and Canva, such that it's built domestically, sold domestically successfully, exported and done successfully outside? I think that's going to be the next big place to go. And because the other reason as well, though, is the space that we play in right now to B2B is very crowded. It's just like you're going to bump up against another fish really easily. But there's this huge blue ocean you can go out and swim around and no one's there. But it's scary to think about because, again, the Australian consumer isn't also necessarily there either. So I think there's going to be this, Australian consumers are becoming more and more comfortable with that. Entrepreneurs are going to start, and we're going to find this place where there's going to be Aussie consumer products, digital products we use and love, and that the world loves, just like Canva, Xero, Atlassian. And I think that's going to be crazy exciting. But I also think it's not necessarily going to be digital. I think more and more people are starting to go like, we can build stuff here too, right? We can create food products, beverage products. We can create physical products. And what if we can, better than the imports that are coming in? I think there is a craft starting to develop too, right? So I think that's going to be crazy exciting, just because it's more interesting, right? As entrepreneurs and crafts people come together to build purely domestic product, right? And really like go after the import market. I think that's going to be super exciting.
Do you fantasize about a social media reset? Or at least...
I don't use social media at all.
Really?
Yeah, I'm like just not someone who's... I'm super old school and I'm not interested or, it doesn't...
How do you manage it with your kids?
I mean, I definitely... I understand... Like, I get to experience it through their experiences, but also get to be part of that conversation with them about my concerns around safety and also the role it plays in, having a balanced life, right? And so I certainly don't want them to not do technology. I think that's not a feasible strategy, but I want them to also understand that having physical friends in meet space is really important. And just like everything, as everyone...
What was the last meet space?
Meet space, right? Like, all of us, it's like...
Physical meeting.
Right, but at the same time, I'm an entrepreneur, right? I'm always looking for the place that no one else is at so I can go there and like, the Wild West, right? So as everyone becomes highly competent digitally, we're losing the ability to meet in person. So go develop those skills. And as the pendulum always swings back, you will be in a great place to go, I actually have no problem with that. I can go speak to human beings. I can go meet people, in meet space and have not a problem with it. So yeah, like watch the pendulum swing, think where it's going to swing back to and try and get there too. I think that's the way to win, right?
I'm running out of time with you, but I haven't even asked you a question about the big thing that's happened over the last 2 years in the world. But if you could change one thing about it, or you could implement a piece of innovation, because you're an entrepreneur, right? So if more of them got their heads together and tried to think of some solutions, what's one key one you'd maybe like to roll out or implement or try to help us get to a better stage than what we're at?
Mate, so I think the first thing that you realize is politicians in general are useless, right? At being politicians. Putting a pandemic in their hands and expecting them to be able to deal with it, what a clusterfuck that was, right? One of the saddest things was, and I experienced this with the kids at a school level, is there's data science and data models would have shown you that there was absolutely a way to control that at a very low level, right? At like the, at the suburb level, at the school level, at the family communication level. But that requires technology and an understanding of data science, right? What I wish was that when the pandemic hit, we were in a better position to understand that data science would have unlocked a less egregious response than lock everything down, right? It's such a blunt instrument, right? So crude a response to such a complex, issue. And so I would have loved to have seen more of that. And in fact, I'll be honest with you, I would love to see just more of that thinking in general, right? I think there's such an aversion to understanding data. There's such an aversion to putting our trust in probabilities, right? And forecasting what we think might happen, that all we want to do is look back and say, well, it happened, I guess it'll happen again. And that's never going to move us forward in any particular path. So whether it's coronavirus, whether it's whatever comes next, I hope that we start to realize the power that data forecasting probability models can give us in making better decisions, because there is no 1 or 0 situation, right? You can only get to a level of confidence that makes sense, and you have to balance that risk. But I think, again, I hope it also stimulates a change in the way we put our trust in the politicians, because we're asking them to do the most basic things like fix the road and, make sure the school doesn't burn down. That's about as far as they can get, right? Like, to ask them to do anything more is just not feasible. So we need to start thinking about that as a society of how do we make sure that when these major issues happen, the decision making process doesn't lie with those folks, right? And if that means creating a new arm or a new body of the decision making or the democratic process, we need to be thinking about these things. We need to make sure those are independent, aren't tied to any of these political goals, and are highly advanced in the way they think about data and science and STEM and mathematics, right? So that needs to be more than lip service. It needs to start happening. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves exactly where we were the last 2 years, is my take.
David Lemphers, amazing.
Thanks so much for having me
being
on.
here.
That was awesome.